I locked your credit card. My husband's voice came through the speaker of my SUV as calmly as if he were reminding me to pick up milk on the way home. For a second, I honestly thought I'd misheard him.
What?
I locked your credit card, he repeated. You won't be using it again until we have a conversation. Before I could answer, another familiar voice pushed its way onto the call, my mother-in-law. Ask us before you spend a dime, she said, every word dripping with satisfaction. Silence filled the car. I could almost picture her standing in my kitchen with her arms folded, wearing the same smug smile she'd perfected over the past 3 years. Neither of them expected my reaction. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I simply ended the call. Then I started my engine and drove straight to my bank. 2 hours later, my phone showed 55 missed calls, and by then, everything they thought they controlled was already gone. My name is Emily Carter, and until that afternoon, everyone, including my husband, believed I was the quiet wife who never fought back. I suppose that was partly true. For 17 years, I'd chosen peace over pride more times than I could count. I believed marriages survived because someone had to stay calm when life became messy. Most days, that someone was me. Mark and I met in our 20s while I was finishing graduate school in accounting. He was starting a small construction company with one pickup truck, a toolbox, and more confidence than money. I admired that confidence. He admired my patience. Neither of us had much, but we built a comfortable life together. Over the years, his company grew. So did my career. I became a CPA specializing in helping medical practices organize their finances, prepare taxes, and plan for long-term growth. My work wasn't flashy, no giant job sites, no company trucks with logos, no newspaper interviews, just spreadsheets, numbers, careful planning, and clients who trusted me with their futures. The income was excellent. Very few people realized just how excellent. That included Mark. He knew I earned a good living. He never asked for details, and I never felt the need to compare salaries. To me, marriage wasn't a competition. Money was simply another tool we used to build our family's future. Together, we raised 2 wonderful children. Olivia was 16, thoughtful, and responsible. Ethan was 14, funny enough to make even difficult days feel lighter. Every financial decision I made centered around those 2 kids. College, snorts, funds, emergency savings, insurance, retirement. If I could remove one future burden from their shoulders, I considered my work worthwhile. For many years, Mark appreciated that. Then everything slowly changed. The change didn't begin with money. It began with grief. 3 years earlier, Mark's father passed away unexpectedly after suffering a heart attack. His mother, Diane, suddenly found herself alone. Neither of us wanted her living by herself. So, we invited her into our home. At first, it seemed like the right thing to do. She was polite, helpful, grateful. She cooked dinner, folded laundry, picked the kids up from school when our schedules became hectic. I honestly believed we were doing something kind. Looking back, I think that was the last peaceful season our family ever had. Little by little, Diane stopped acting like a guest. She became an authority. It started with harmless opinions. You shouldn't let teenagers sleep so late. Emily spends too much on organic groceries. Why buy name-brand detergent? None of those comments bothered me very much. Everyone has opinions. I smiled and changed the subject. Then the comments became instructions, then rules, then criticism. She questioned birthday presents. She questioned vacation plans. She questioned what I ordered at restaurants. One afternoon, she actually looked inside my grocery bags before I finished unloading the car. $30 for coffee beans? She asked. I laughed. They last almost a month. She shook her head. That's how people waste money. I remember standing there thinking, I bought those with my paycheck. Why does this even concern her? Still, I let it go. Again, peace felt easier than confrontation. Unfortunately, peace has a strange way of teaching controlling people that you'll accept even more. Several months later, Mark suggested we simplify our finances. Let's move everything into one household budget, he said. It sounded reasonable. Married couples do that every day. So I agreed. What I didn't notice was how often Diane sat nearby while we discussed money. Sometimes she didn't even pretend not to listen. Eventually, She started answering questions directed at me. If you ask me, here's what I do. A wife doesn't need separate spending money. I laughed the first time she said it. She wasn't joking. Mark didn't seem to notice, or maybe he chose not to. Whenever I privately told him his mother was becoming too involved, he always gave the same answer.
She's old-fashioned.
She means well. Just ignore it. Ignoring it became harder. One evening I bought Olivia a dress for her junior homecoming dance. Nothing outrageous, just a beautiful blue dress she'd fallen in love with after weeks of saving birthday money. When Diane saw the receipt, she frowned. You paid that much? Olivia quietly disappeared upstairs. I answered calmly. She deserves something special. Diane looked directly at Mark. See, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Instead of defending me, he sighed. Maybe Mom has a point. That hurt far more than I admitted. Not because of the dress, because my husband had stopped seeing me as his partner. Little by little, he had begun seeing me through someone else's eyes. Still, I never stopped contributing. Every month, I quietly handled our taxes. I adjusted retirement accounts. I reviewed insurance policies. I increased our emergency savings. Whenever Mark's business experienced a slow season, I shifted money around so payroll never bounced. He never asked how I managed it. He simply assumed everything always worked itself out. Sometimes the people who benefit most from your sacrifices are the ones who notice them the least. Then came the shopping trip that changed everything. I bought a laptop for Ethan. His old one had finally died while he was finishing a school project. I didn't think twice. I'd researched prices, found a holiday sale, used the family credit card. A perfectly ordinary purchase. Apparently, Diane saw the transaction. Notification before Mark did. By the time he called me that afternoon, they had already decided I needed to be taught a lesson. They honestly believed locking one credit card would remind me who was in charge. What neither of them understood was something I had never bothered explaining. That credit card wasn't the foundation of our family's financial security. I was. And as I parked outside my bank that afternoon, I realized something else. For 17 years, I had protected everyone else's future. It was finally time to protect my own. When people hear stories like mine, they usually imagine that controlling behavior appears overnight. It doesn't. At least it didn't in my marriage. It arrived one tiny compromise at a time. Each one seemed too small to fight about. Each one felt easier to forgive than confront. By the time I realized how much had changed, I barely recognized the marriage Mark and I had built together. The morning after Diane moved into our home, she stood in my kitchen making pancakes while humming an old country song. She smiled when I walked in. I figured I'd make breakfast so you could sleep a little longer. I hugged her. You don't have to do that.
I know, she said.
I want to. Back then, I truly loved having her around. She adored the grandchildren. She told wonderful stories about Mark as a little boy. She remembered birthdays. She baked pies from scratch every Thanksgiving. If someone had told me that woman would eventually encourage my husband to control my finances, I would have laughed. Life rarely announces the moment everything begins to change. It simply keeps moving while the changes quietly pile up. About 6 months after she moved in, I noticed Diane asking unusual questions. How much does your office pay these days? Oh, enough. More than Mark? I smiled politely. We both do well. She didn't like that answer. She wanted numbers, comparisons, a winner. I never gave her one. Money had never been a competition inside my marriage, at least not until she made it one. One Saturday afternoon, Mark came home from a job site exhausted. His construction company had landed several commercial remodeling contracts, and he was working nearly every weekend. I poured him a glass of iced tea while he sat at the kitchen table. Before he could even take a sip, Diane spoke. Emily bought another one of those expensive candles. Mark looked confused. What candle? The one sitting in the living room. He shrugged. If she likes it, it was $40. He looked at me. You spent $40 on a candle. I laughed. Actually, it was $38. He smiled.
Still seems high.
It'll probably last 6 months. That should have been the end of the conversation. Instead, Diane quietly added, little purchases like that are why people never build wealth. I nearly laughed again. If only she knew. The irony was almost unbearable. That single candle cost less than the monthly dividends from one investment account I'd built years earlier. But I didn't say that.
There was no reason to.
I wasn't interested in proving anyone wrong. The strange thing about financial control is that it rarely begins with major decisions. It begins with questions. Do we really need this? Couldn't we wait? Did you compare prices? Eventually, the questions become expectations. Then, permissions. One evening, I stopped by the grocery store after work. The total came to almost $300. Food wasn't cheap anymore. Neither were paper towels, laundry detergent, or the snacks two growing teenagers could somehow inhale in a single weekend. As I unloaded everything onto the kitchen counter, Diane started picking through the bags. She held up a package of fresh salmon. This wasn't on sale.
No.
You bought fresh berries.
Yes.
And imported cheese? I smiled. The kids love it. She sighed dramatically. When I raised my family, we learned the difference between needs and wants. Before I could answer, Mark walked in. Without even hearing the conversation, he asked, "Everything okay?" Diane answered for me, "We're just talking about budgeting." Mark looked at the groceries. Maybe Mom's right. We could probably cut back a little. I looked at him. On food. He avoided my eyes. I'm just saying, she's got experience. Experience? That word became his shield. Whenever Diane criticized me, he called it experience. Whenever she interfered, he called it advice. Whenever I felt dismissed, he told me not to take things personally. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up, not because I agreed, because I was tired. Meanwhile, my own work continued quietly. Most mornings, I arrived at my office before 8 o'clock. My clients included surgeons, dentists, family physicians, and physical therapy practices. I loved helping people make smart financial decisions. Some doctors earned incredible incomes but struggled to save anything. Others worried constantly despite being financially secure. Money, I learned long ago, wasn't just math. It was emotion, fear, pride, security, hope. Ironically, I could help strangers organize their financial lives, while my own household slowly became emotionally bankrupt. Around that time, Mark's business experienced a difficult winter. Several commercial projects were delayed because of weather. Invoices were paid late. Payroll deadlines stayed exactly the same. He came home frustrated almost every evening. I don't know how we're going to cover everything this month. I quietly opened my laptop. Let's look at it. For 2 hours, we reviewed numbers together. I reorganized payment schedules, shifted cash flow, delayed non-essential purchases, moved money between accounts. Everything balanced. He smiled with relief. I don't know how you always figure this stuff out. I smiled back. It's what I do. What I didn't mention was that I had also transferred money from an investment account I personally owned to protect his business. Not because he asked, because I believed his success was our success. Marriage isn't supposed to keep score, so I never did. The children noticed more than we realized. One evening, Olivia knocked on my bedroom door. Mom. Yeah. Grandma doesn't like you very much, does she? The question caught me off guard. What makes you say that? She only complains about things you buy. I forced a smile. Adults disagree sometimes. Olivia sat beside me. I've never heard her complain when Dad buys fishing gear. I laughed softly. Neither have I. She hesitated. I don't think it's fair. I wrapped my arm around her shoulders. Life isn't always fair. She looked up at me. But you're always nice to her. I kissed the top of her head. That's because kindness says more about us than it does about the other person. At the time, I believed those words completely. Now, I'm not so sure kindness should always look like silence. Sometimes silence simply gives disrespect permission to grow. Then came the conversation that changed everything. I wasn't supposed to hear it. I had come home early after a client canceled. As I walked through the garage, I heard voices inside the kitchen.
Mark and Diane.
Neither realized I was already home. You spoil her, Diane said. I don't. You do. She spends whatever she wants. Mark sighed. She works hard. So what? You're the husband. There was a long silence. Then Diane delivered the sentence that stayed with me for weeks. A man who doesn't control the money eventually loses control of his family. I stood frozen in the garage waiting, praying Mark would laugh. Tell her she was wrong. Tell her marriage wasn't about control. Instead, I heard him quietly say, "Maybe you're right." Those 4 words broke something inside me that I didn't know could break. Not because he agreed with his mother, because he no longer trusted the woman who had spent 17 years standing beside him. A week later, Ethan's laptop finally died in the middle of a school assignment. I drove him to an electronics store after work. We found a reliable model on sale. Nothing extravagant, just exactly what he needed. I paid with our household credit card without thinking twice. When we walked into the house carrying the box, Diane's eyes immediately landed on the receipt sticking out of the shopping bag. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. By the next afternoon, my phone rang, and my husband decided to teach me a lesson his mother had spent months convincing him to give. The parking lot outside my bank looked exactly as it had every other Tuesday afternoon. Parents hurried past with toddlers. An elderly couple slowly crossed toward the entrance, holding hands. A landscaping crew trimmed hedges along the sidewalk. Nothing about the scene suggested that my marriage was quietly unraveling. I turned off the engine and looked at my phone one last time. No missed calls yet. Just the memory of Mark's voice. "I locked your credit card, then Diane's. Ask us before you spend a dime." I set my phone face down on the passenger seat. For the first time in years, I wasn't walking into a bank to solve someone else's financial problem. I was finally walking in to solve my own. The branch manager, Karen Mitchell, greeted me before I even reached her office. "Emily, it's good to see you." Karen and I had worked together for almost a decade. Not socially, professionally. She knew I handled complex financial planning for medical practices, and over the years she had helped me establish several personal accounts. She noticed my expression immediately. "You okay?" I smiled politely. "I've had better afternoons." She closed her office door. "What can I do for you?" I took a slow breath. "I need to separate my finances." She didn't react with surprise. Bankers see divorces, business failures, estate disputes, family conflicts. She simply nodded. "Let's go through everything carefully. No drama, no judgment, just professionalism." Exactly what I needed. Karen pulled up every account connected to my name. Some were joint, some belonged solely to me. Others had been opened years before Mark and I were married. I reviewed each one carefully. "I'd like to stop my paycheck from going into the joint account." "No problem. I'd like to redirect my direct deposit." She typed a few notes.
Done.
"I also want to stop the automatic transfers that come from my personal investment account." She looked up. The monthly transfers.
Yes.
Those transfers had quietly covered more than anyone in my house realized. Whenever Mark's business cash flow became tight, I'd move money into our household account. Sometimes it was a few $1,000s, sometimes considerably more. I never announced it. I never wanted credit. I simply wanted stability. Karen processed the request. "The transfers end today." I nodded. "Thank you." Next came my personal savings account, then my brokerage account, then the trust my late aunt had left me years earlier. Mark knew I'd received an inheritance. He had no idea I'd invested nearly all of it instead of spending it. The investments had grown steadily over the years, not through luck, through patience. Every dividend, every interest payment, every reinvestment, slowly, quietly, the way real wealth often grows. I'd like these accounts completely separated from any household activity. Karen confirmed the paperwork.
Done.
She turned the monitor toward me. There are also several guarantees attached to Mark's business credit lines. I wasn't surprised. Years earlier, when his company was still expanding, I'd agreed to serve as an additional financial guarantor because my income and assets strengthened the applications. At the time, it made perfect sense. We were partners. Today felt different. I'd like to remove myself wherever legally possible. Karen nodded thoughtfully. Some agreements allow immediate withdrawal after review. Others require replacement documentation. I understand. She handed me several forms. I signed each one carefully, not angrily, not emotionally, simply carefully. Every signature represented something much larger than money. It represented a boundary, one I should have drawn years earlier. Karen paused. I hope you don't mind me asking. I smiled. Go ahead. Is this heading toward divorce? I looked down at my wedding ring. For 17 years I'd worn it without ever imagining taking it off. I honestly don't know. She nodded gently. Sometimes separating finances saves a marriage. I looked back up. I hope you're right. Because despite everything, I still loved my husband. Love wasn't the problem. Respect was. Almost 2 hours had passed when we finished. Karen handed me a folder containing updated account information. Everything that belongs solely to you is now completely independent. I thanked her. As I stood to leave, she said something I'll never forget. You've spent your career protecting other people's financial futures. She smiled kindly. Don't apologize for protecting your own. For some reason, those words almost made me cry. Instead, I simply thanked her again. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than before. I climbed into my SUV and finally picked up my phone. 23 missed calls, most from Mark, several from Diane, 2 from home, 1 from Olivia. A voicemail notification appeared. I didn't listen, not yet. I started the engine. Before I even backed out of the parking space, the phone rang again.
Mark.
I watched it vibrate until it stopped. 5 seconds later, another call, then another, then another. I drove home without answering a single one. Halfway home, my phone buzzed with a text. Where are you? A minute later, call me immediately. Then another, something's wrong with the business accounts. I kept driving. Another message. Emily, please answer. Another. Payroll isn't processing. Then one from Diane. What did you do? I almost laughed. Not because anyone was suffering, because for the first time they were asking the right question. What did I do? Nothing illegal, nothing dishonest, nothing secret. I simply stopped quietly carrying responsibilities they never realized were mine. When I reached home, Mark's truck wasn't in the driveway. Neither was Diane's car. The house was quiet. Inside, Olivia sat at the kitchen island doing homework. She looked up the moment I walked in. Mom? Hi, sweetheart. She studied my face. Are you okay? I will be. She hesitated. Dad left really fast.
I know.
He looked scared. That surprised me. Scared wasn't a word my daughter usually associated with her father. What happened? I don't know. She shrugged. Grandma kept saying something about the bank. I smiled softly. Did either of them say anything to you? She shook her head.
No. Good.
I wasn't going to drag my children into an adult conflict. They deserved better. An hour later, Ethan came home from baseball practice. He immediately noticed the tension. What's going on? Nothing you need to worry about. He looked unconvinced. Before anyone could say another word, the front door burst open. Mark walked in. His face looked paler than I'd ever seen. His shirt was damp with sweat despite the air conditioning. He wasn't angry. He looked terrified. Emily. I calmly set my coffee mug on the counter.
Hi.
He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Payroll didn't go through. I nodded.
I know.
The operating account, he struggled to finish the sentence. It's short. I know. His breathing became uneven. The mortgage payment is pending. I know. Behind him, Diane rushed into the kitchen. For the first time since she'd moved into our home, she wasn't smiling. What did you do? She demanded. I looked directly at her. I protected what belonged to me. She opened her mouth to argue. Before she could speak, Mark's phone rang again. He glanced at the screen. His accountant. He answered immediately. I watched every ounce of confidence drain from his face as he listened. When the call ended, he lowered the phone slowly. His voice barely rose above a whisper. They're asking where the monthly transfers went. The room became perfectly still. For years, those transfers had appeared like clockwork. No one had ever wondered who funded them until they stopped. My phone vibrated again. I looked down. The missed call count had climbed even higher. By bedtime, it would reach 55. And my husband was only beginning to understand that the strongest foundation beneath our family had never been the business he built. It had been the wife he had taken for granted. Mark stood in the middle of our kitchen, holding his phone like it had suddenly become too heavy to carry. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the refrigerator humming behind us. Finally, Diane broke the silence. "You can't just take money away from your family." I looked at her calmly. "I didn't." She frowned. "Then why are his accounts short?"
Because I stopped putting my money into them.
She blinked. "My money?" I repeated the word slowly, not because she couldn't hear them, but because I wasn't sure she'd ever truly believed they existed. "My paycheck, my investments, my personal accounts." Mark stared at me. "What are you talking about?" I met his eyes. "You really don't know, do you?" His expression answered the question before he said a word. No, he didn't. I walked upstairs without another sentence. Neither of them followed immediately. When I returned a few minutes later, I carried a large gray file box. It was heavier than it looked. 17 years of paperwork tensed away quite a bit. I placed it gently on the dining room table. Mark looked confused. "What is that?" "Our financial history." I removed the lid. Inside were neatly labeled folders: tax returns, mortgage statements, investment reports, insurance policies, business records, emergency saving summaries, everything organized the same way I organized every client's financial life. I slid the first folder across the table. "Open it." He hesitated, then he did. Inside were copies of payroll records from 4 years earlier. The winter his company nearly lost 3 commercial contracts. "You remember that January?" I asked. He nodded. "It was awful."
You.
She handed me several forms. I signed each one carefully, not angrily, not emotionally, simply carefully. Every signature represented something much larger than money. It represented a boundary, one I should have drawn years earlier. Karen paused. "I hope you don't mind me asking." I smiled. "Go ahead. Is this heading toward divorce?" I looked down at my wedding ring. For 17 years I'd worn it without ever imagining taking it off. "I honestly don't know." She nodded gently. "Sometimes separating finances saves a marriage." I looked back up. "I hope you're right. Because despite everything, I still loved my husband. Love wasn't the problem. Respect was." Almost 2 hours had passed when we finished. Karen handed me a folder containing updated account information. "Everything that belongs solely to you is now completely independent." I thanked her. As I stood to leave, she said something I'll never forget. "You've spent your career protecting other people's financial futures." She smiled kindly. "Don't apologize for protecting your own." For some reason, those words almost made me cry. Instead, I simply thanked her again. Outside, the afternoon sun felt warmer than before. I climbed into my SUV and finally picked up my phone. 23 missed calls, most from Mark, several from Diane, 2 from home, 1 from Olivia. A voicemail notification appeared. I didn't listen, not yet. I started the engine. Before I even backed out of the parking space, the phone rang again.
Mark.
I watched it vibrate until it stopped. 5 seconds later, another call, then another, then another. I drove home without answering a single one. Halfway home, my phone buzzed with a text. "Where are you?" A minute later, "Call me immediately." Then another, "Something's wrong with the business accounts." I kept driving. Another message, "Emily, please answer." Another, "Payroll isn't processing." Then one from Diane, "What did you do?" I almost laughed. Not because anyone was suffering, because for the first time they were asking the right question. What did I do? Nothing illegal, nothing dishonest, nothing secret. I simply stopped quietly carrying responsibilities they never realized were mine. When I reached home, Mark's truck wasn't in the driveway. Neither was Diane's car. The house was quiet. Inside, Olivia sat at the kitchen island doing homework. She looked up the moment I walked in. "Mom?" "Hi, sweetheart." She studied my face. "Are you okay?" "I will be." She hesitated. "Dad left really fast."
I know.
He looked scared. That surprised me. Scared wasn't a word my daughter usually associated with her father. "What happened?" "I don't know." She shrugged. "Grandma kept saying something about the bank." I smiled softly. "Did either of them say anything to you?" She shook her head.
No. Good.
I wasn't going to drag my children into an adult conflict. They deserved better. An hour later, Ethan came home from baseball practice. He immediately noticed the tension. What's going on? Nothing you need to worry about. He looked unconvinced. Before anyone could say another word, the front door burst open. Mark walked in. His face looked paler than I'd ever seen. His shirt was damp with sweat despite the air conditioning. He wasn't angry. He looked terrified. Emily. I calmly set my coffee mug on the counter.
Hi.
He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Payroll didn't go through. I nodded.
I know.
The operating account, he struggled to finish the sentence. It's short. I know. His breathing became uneven. The mortgage payment is pending. I know. Behind him, Diane rushed into the kitchen. For the first time since she'd moved into our home, she wasn't smiling. What did you do? She demanded. I looked directly at her. I protected what belonged to me. She opened her mouth to argue. Before she could speak, Mark's phone rang again. He glanced at the screen. His accountant. He answered immediately. I watched every ounce of confidence drain from his face as he listened. When the call ended, he lowered the phone slowly. His voice barely rose above a whisper. They're asking where the monthly transfers went. The room became perfectly still. For years, those transfers had appeared like clockwork. No one had ever wondered who funded them until they stopped. My phone vibrated again. I looked down. The missed call count had climbed even higher. By bedtime, it would reach 55. And my husband was only beginning to understand that the strongest foundation beneath our family had never been the business he built. It had been the wife he had taken for granted. Mark stood in the middle of our kitchen, holding his phone like it had suddenly become too heavy to carry. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The only sound came from the refrigerator humming behind us. Finally, Diane broke the silence. You can't just take money away from your family. I looked at her calmly. I didn't. She frowned. Then why are his accounts short?
Because I stopped putting my money into them.
She blinked. My money? I repeated the word slowly. Not because she couldn't hear them, but because I wasn't sure she'd ever truly believed they existed. My paycheck, my investments, my personal accounts. Mark stared at me. What are you talking about? I met his eyes. You really don't know, do you? His expression answered the question before he said a word. No, he didn't. I walked upstairs without another sentence. Neither of them followed immediately. When I returned a few minutes later, I carried a large gray file box. It was heavier than it looked. 17 years of paperwork tensed away quite a bit. I placed it gently on the dining room table. Mark looked confused. What is that? Our financial history. I removed the lid. Inside were neatly labeled folders: tax returns, mortgage statements, investment reports, insurance policies, business records, emergency savings summaries, everything organized the same way I organized every client's financial life. I slid the first folder across the table. Open it. He hesitated, then he did. Inside were copies of payroll records from 4 years earlier. The winter his company nearly lost 3 commercial contracts. You remember that January? I asked. He nodded. It was awful. The outside. Inside, my thoughts kept returning to one question: could trust actually be rebuilt? I had helped clients recover from bankruptcy. I'd seen businesses survive disasters. I'd watched families rebuild after terrible financial mistakes. But rebuilding a marriage that required something numbers could never measure: humility. When I arrived home, Diane's car was gone. Mark was sitting alone on the back patio. 2 untouched cups of coffee rested on the table between us. He stood as I walked outside. Thanks for coming. I live here. A faint embarrassed smile crossed his face. I guess you do. We sat without speaking for nearly a minute. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It simply felt honest. Finally, he looked at me. I asked Mom to spend a few days with my sister. I nodded. She wasn't happy. I imagine not. But she went. He rubbed his hands together nervously. I needed to talk to my wife. Those last 2 words caught me by surprise. Not because they were extraordinary, because I hadn't felt like his partner in a very long time. He took a deep breath. I owe you an apology. I waited. Not because I wanted a speech, because I wanted sincerity. I've apologized before,
You have.
but usually it was to end an argument.
I didn't disagree.
This time, he looked directly into my eyes. I'm apologizing because I finally understand what I actually did. I remained quiet. You weren't spending my money. No, you were protecting our family.
Yes.
And I let my own mother convince me that protecting meant controlling. His voice cracked. I became someone I never wanted to be. There it was, not an excuse, recognition. Sometimes that's where real healing begins. I need you to understand something, I said softly. He nodded. When you locked that credit card, I paused. I wasn't hurt because I couldn't buy groceries. He listened carefully. I was hurt because my husband believed I needed permission. He lowered his head. I know.
No.
I gently shook my head. I don't think you did. I leaned forward. Do you know what went through my mind? He whispered. What? I thought my voice caught unexpectedly. After 17 years, this man doesn't know me at all. His eyes filled with tears again.
I'm so sorry.
I know. And I don't expect you to forgive me today. I appreciated that answer. Forgiveness should never be demanded. It has to grow. A few minutes later, he quietly asked, Can I ask you something? Of course. Why didn't you scream at me yesterday? I smiled faintly. I wanted to. He almost laughed through his tears. I deserved it. Maybe. I looked out across our backyard, but screaming would have changed the volume. I looked back at him. Not the lesson. He nodded slowly. I understand now. I hope so. Later that evening, Diane called. She asked if she could stop by. I almost said no, then I remembered something my father used to tell me. If people are willing to admit they're wrong, at least give them the chance to speak. An hour later, she walked through the front door carrying a small pie from the neighborhood bakery. It felt strangely familiar. The first week she'd lived with us, she'd brought home pies, too. This time, however, she looked 10 years older. She sat quietly across from me at the dining room table. For several moments, she couldn't meet my eyes. Finally, she spoke. I owe you an apology. I listened. When Harold died, she swallowed hard. I was terrified. Harold had been Mark's father. I didn't know who I was without him. Tears rolled down her cheeks. I was afraid of being alone. Her voice became smaller. And I was afraid my son wouldn't need me anymore. No one interrupted. I started giving advice because it made me feel useful. She twisted a tissue in her hands. Then I started believing my advice mattered more than yours. She looked at me. I convinced myself I was protecting him. I nodded. I know, but I wasn't. Another tear slipped down her face. I was driving a wedge between the two people who loved each other. She looked toward Mark. I'm ashamed of that. For the first time since she'd entered the room, I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not pride, not control, just an elderly widow who had allowed grief to turn into fear. Fear had become interference. Interference had become manipulation. Understanding that didn't erase the damage, but it explained it. I folded my hands together. If we're going to move forward, both of them looked at me. Things have to change. Mark nodded immediately. Anything?
No.
I smiled gently. Not anything. I spoke carefully. We'll have one household budget that we both review. Agreed. We'll each keep personal accounts. Agreed. No one needs permission to buy reasonable personal items. Yes. Absolutely. And major financial decisions we make together, Mark finished. Together. I nodded. Also, I looked toward Diane. I love you because you're my children's grandmother. Her eyes filled again. But our marriage belongs to Mark and me. She whispered. I understand. You don't get to make decisions for us anymore. I won't. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply accepted the boundary that more than anything convinced me she truly wanted to change. A week later, Mark surprised me. He handed me a business card. It belonged to a licensed marriage counselor. I already made the appointment. You did. He smiled nervously. I figured rebuilding trust deserves professional help. I laughed softly. That's probably the smartest financial decision you've made all year. For the first time in days, we both laughed. Not because everything was fixed, because hope had quietly returned. Hope doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives with one honest conversation and two people finally willing to listen. People often assume that forgiveness arrives the moment someone says, "I'm sorry." It doesn't. At least it didn't for me. An apology can open a door. Walking through it takes time. Trust doesn't return because someone promises to change. It returns because they actually do. One ordinary day at a time. Our first counseling session felt awkward. Mark and I sat on opposite ends of a comfortable gray sofa, while our therapist, Dr. Reynolds, smiled warmly from across the room. "I'd like to ask each of you one question," she said. Mark nodded. "So would I." She looked at me first. "What did you lose?" I answered without thinking, my sense of being his partner. Then she turned to Mark. "What did you lose?" He stared at the floor for several seconds. I lost sight of the woman who'd been standing beside me all along. Neither answer solved our marriage. But for the first time in years, we were talking about feelings instead of finances. That mattered. Because money had never actually been the problem. Money had simply exposed a problem that had been quietly growing for years. Over the next several months, we changed more than our bank accounts. Every Sunday evening after dinner, we sat at the kitchen table with coffee and reviewed our finances together. Not because one of us needed permission, because both of us deserved transparency. The meetings were surprisingly simple. We talked about upcoming bills, vacation plans, college savings, home repairs, charitable donations. Sometimes we disagreed. The difference was that we listened before responding. No one kept score. No one tried to win. Some conversations lasted 10 minutes, others lasted an hour. Every one of them ended with both of us understanding exactly where we stood. I realized something during those evenings. Communication isn't about avoiding disagreements. It's about making sure respect survives them.
Gone.
We also made another important decision. We kept our joint household account for shared expenses, but we each maintained personal checking and savings accounts. Some people might think that sounds less romantic. I disagree. Trust doesn't require giving up your independence. It requires honoring each other's responsibility. When I bought a new pair of running shoes a few weeks later, I didn't wonder whether someone would question the purchase. When Mark surprised himself with a new fishing rod during a holiday sale, I smiled and asked when he planned to take Ethan to the lake. It wasn't about the shoes or the fishing rod. It was about breathing freely inside our own marriage again. The biggest surprise came from our children. One Saturday morning, Olivia walked into the kitchen carrying a notebook. "Can you guys help me make a college budget?" I looked at Mark.
He looked at me.
Then we both laughed. "Absolutely," we said at the same time. For the next hour, we talked with both kids about student loans, credit cards, emergency funds, and the importance of living below your means. I didn't hide what had happened between Mark and me. I simply didn't burden them with every painful detail. Instead, I told them something I wish someone had told me years earlier. The healthiest financial relationship isn't built on who controls the money. It's built on honesty, respect, and shared responsibility. Olivia wrote the sentence down. Months later, I found it taped inside her planner. That tiny piece of paper meant more to me than she probably realized. Diane changed, too. Not overnight, but noticeably. A few weeks after moving in with Mark's sister for a short time, she asked if we could have lunch together, just the two of us. I accepted. We met at a small diner we'd both always liked. Halfway through our meal, she quietly admitted something. "I started volunteering at the senior center." "Really?" She smiled. "They needed someone to help organize donation records." I laughed. "So, you're doing bookkeeping now?" She nodded proudly. "It keeps me busy." More importantly, I think it gave her something she'd been missing: purpose. She no longer needed to insert herself into our marriage to feel valuable. She had built a life outside of it. She still offered advice from time to time. The difference was simple. She waited until we asked, and when we said, "We've got it," she smiled and let it go. That small change transformed our relationship more than either of us expected. Almost a year after the day Mark locked my credit card, we celebrated our 18th wedding anniversary. Nothing extravagant. Just dinner at the little Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated our 10th anniversary years earlier. As we finished dessert, Mark reached into his jacket pocket. For a brief second, I wondered if he'd bought jewelry. Instead, he slid a small envelope across the table. Inside was a replacement credit card. Not because I needed one. Mine had worked perfectly well all year. He smiled. I think this belongs in your wallet. I looked at him. You know I already have cards. I know. He reached across the table and gently took my hand. This one's different.
How?
It's not about spending. He paused. It's about trust. I smiled. You know. I slipped the card back into the envelope. I never wanted the card. I know. I wanted my husband to believe I was his equal. He squeezed my hand. You always were. I was just too blind to see it. There was no dramatic applause, no perfect movie ending, just two people who had nearly lost each other, choosing each other again. Sometimes people ask whether I regret driving to the bank that afternoon. My answer is always the same.
No.
Because I didn't go there to punish my husband. I went there to protect my dignity. There's an important difference. Revenge may satisfy your anger for a moment. Self-respect changes the rest of your life. If Mark had never admitted he was wrong, our story probably would have ended very differently. But he chose accountability over pride, and I chose boundaries over bitterness. Together those choices gave our marriage a second chance. Today our grandchildren know us as grandparents who laugh too loudly during board games and spoil them with homemade cookies.